Thank you so much.
Thank you. So,
oh my goodness, my wife is watching that thinking, that's why I never see him at home.
yeah, believe it. We were all a little exhausted. We should point out that Lester did nightly news from Burbank and then hightailed it over here. So you get a second round of applause for battling LA traffic and getting here on time.
Thank you. I'm feeling a little out of place because we go on the air normally in 20 minutes on the West Coast, but there's football tonight, so we're good.
Oh, you're good. All right.
Thursday night football.
So we don't get the East Coast feed here. So what was the top story tonight?
The top story tonight was Senator Franken, whose name has been added to the list of notable American powerful people who've been accused of sexual misconduct.
Was there much debate about that being the top story today?
No, I don't think so. That was a pretty easy call. I think that one, not only was it a claim, but it was accompanied by a photo that said it all, and he fell on his sword about it. So, you know, there've been so many claims. Obviously, the Judge Moore, that was the second story, but Franken was a pretty easy call.
Mm-hmm. This moment, I mean, we watched your reel and we are both admiring and exhausted by that. But in all seriousness, this moment in history for journalists is, I think, unprecedented in the pace and the volume of, before we get to sort of the political climate, the pace and volume and unrelenting amount of news that we have coming at us. Have you experienced a time like this ever in your career?
Certainly no. We all look at each other and it's like, when is this going to slow down? 2 weeks ago, I anchored the news in Los Angeles at least a few times a month, and I was here for a 4-day stint. Saturday, I was scheduled to travel to South Korea, where the president was going to be visiting. So got on a plane Saturday morning from LAX, went to South Korea, landed, had room service, went to bed, woke up, and saw what was happening in Texas at the church, and quickly repacked. So I think my total time on the ground in Seoul was 19 hours, and then we're on our way to Texas. And the thing that struck me there was, I just did this. We were just in Las Vegas, and one of the phenomena that we're watching right now that I've never seen is that stories that 5-10 years ago, we would have been there all week and maybe into the second week, and America would have kind of stopped and slowed down and absorbed the horror of these things. Now they're happening at such a frequency, and the rate that we're being shocked on so many levels right now has really given these things very short attention. We had a terror attack in New York a few weeks ago. It feels like it was months ago. Somebody ran down 8 people on a bike path. You know, the shooting in Las Vegas, the Texas shooting. Now, we had a story on our broadcast about that tonight with regard to some gun legislation, but largely these things, our attention moves on very quickly. That doesn't mean we're bad people. It just means we're being overwhelmed right now by on so many levels.
And how are you managing that?
Well, we try to, it's what we do. I truly believe that as journalists, we can't be totally dispassionate. I mean, we're affected by these things as well. I mean, there's the sadness of some of the things we cover, and especially the sense of, I'm interviewing, sometimes I'll be interviewing somebody at one of these horrific scenes thinking, okay, where's the next place I'll be? I remember in Vegas saying that out loud. Okay, today it's Las Vegas. When's the next one? Where will it be? Well, it turns out it was a small town in Texas. So it does take a toll on you at some point, because these are people, and it's there, but for the grace of God go I. I mean, it could have been me, someone I love, in these places when these things happen.
I want to turn from sort of news events to the day to the political climate and covering politics in the age of Trump. When we talk about the relentlessness of the news cycle, that's been going on since the campaign, really. At what point through the campaign election, in that period of time, did you know that really this was a time like no other, that we weren't able to follow the rule book of the past?
I think it snuck up on people because, especially those of us in New York media, we knew Donald Trump. He would come on. I used to do the Today Show. He'd come on sometimes after the last episode of The Apprentice, and so we knew him, and his style as a candidate was not much different than his style as a guy who was selling television shows. But I do remember the conversations. People were, doesn't have a chance, and I remember saying, months out, I said, no, this could happen. Doesn't mean I'm any clairvoyant, but I just had a sense that the mood of the country was in such a place that it could possibly happen. But I will say that the man you look at today is the man that was running. I mean, there was no bait and switch, and I think sometimes we get confused by that this was he is the president that he said he was going to be, for better or worse.
Now, you moderated in 2016 the first debate between Secretary Clinton and President Trump.
See my hand starting to shake when you said that?
Yeah. Did you have a pretty good sense by that time just how challenging that assignment was going to be?
Oh, there's never been anything more challenging in my life. I mean, I will say that I was having little mini anxiety attacks. I was trying meditation. The difficult thing was not asking questions of these two people. The difficult thing was turning on cable TV and hearing people talk about me. And, well, he needs to do this. Well, I think he should do this. Well, he's not going to fact check. And, you like to think that doesn't get into your head. It does get into your head. It really does. And you try to tune it out the best you can. It was incredibly challenging because of the nature of the two candidates.
We have a clip from the debate, and I believe it's an exchange about Iraq. So, and you have not, is it true that you have not?
I have not watched a second of this debate.
Here you go. Four stories of it. Let's take a look.
Mr. Trump, a lot of these are judgment questions. You had supported the war in Iraq before the invasion. What makes your judgment?
I did not support the war in Iraq.
2002.
That is a mainstream media nonsense put out by her because she, frankly, I think the best person in her campaign is mainstream media.
My question is, since
would you like to
supported it,
hear?
why is your
I was
why is your
against the war.
judgment-
Wait a minute. I was against the war in Iraq, just so you put it out.
The record shows otherwise.
The record
but why
does not show
why
that.
is your
The
judgment
record
any...
shows that I'm right.
Okay, I'm sorry. Did that get your heart going?
That was fun.
Got my heart going a little bit. So again, so how in the world do you do that? How do you determine where you're going to challenge, where you're going to steer, how you're going to get answers for the American
I will go back and watch that debate at some point, but I think watching that,
We'll send you a bottle of wine.
Yeah, I'm going to need one. I think that question occurred. I will tell you, we had weeks of preparation. We had mock debates. We had people playing both these candidates who in many cases had them almost word for word is what we saw. And we had the structure that I was given by the debate commission, but there was a plan of how we'd move things through. I started losing control. I mean, they really started, plowing over me. And there was a moment I said to myself, what the hell with it? I'm just going to be a news guy. That's what I do. I don't know what necessarily qualifies a journalist to be a moderator. It's a very unique kind of a role, and none of us are really trained to be a moderator. But we do know how to ask questions, and we do know how to follow where the news was. He was on the record as, having supported the war in Iraq, so I wasn't going to cede that to get to my question. And
because you're constrained by the format of the debate and letting people respond, counter-respond, and then you just said, I'm not doing it. All bets are off, I'm going.
I thought, what, you picked a newsman to do this, so this is what we're going to do. And that was also the point that I felt like I kind of took the handcuffs off of this sense of equivalency. Just going to go where the stories are, and that's what I did.
We have one more. I'm only going to do one more.
Sure.
I don't want to really
traumatize
you. I'm sorry. Just one more. In this clip, you had changed the topic to racial healing. But here, the conversation takes a slightly different turn.
I'm sorry, I'm just going to follow up, and I will let you respond to that because if there's a lot there, but we're talking about racial healing in this segment. What do you say to Americans?
Well, it was very, I say
people of color
nothing.
who-
I say nothing because I was able to get him to produce it. He should have produced it a long time before. I say nothing. But let me just tell you, when you talk about healing, I think that I've developed very, very good relationships over the last little while with the African American community. I think you can see that.
Yeah, that was, I think that was a line of questioning when I was trying to get him to respond to the birther question with President Obama. He went in that direction.
Yep, he responded to that too, sort
Yeah,
of.
and that was another question that I, was it a debatable point? What could she say about that? But I think it was a point that needed to be discussed, and we still really haven't heard an answer. I think the question, if I recall, was what made you drop it? Why all of a sudden did you decide that he was born in the United States? I don't think we ever got the answer.
But were you surprised to his answer to the question about, you were getting him to focus on this notion of racial healing, and he said, I have nothing to say.
I can't say I was surprised by any of the answers. I mean, it's, listen, I've done other debates. I mean, candidates will go whatever direction they want to go. That's the nature of the game, and even, in interviews, that's, you deflect, you move on. I don't fault anybody for that. So I wasn't really shocked by any of the answers. I think the only thing that really shocked me in that entire debate was in that first 20 minutes, just how strong and how quick they were both coming on. And I'm still trying to, because I'm a rule follower, I'm still, wait a minute, I got my little plan here. And then, that's my nature, like, what? You're not following the rules.
Will you do another one when they ask? Because
Well, it was funny that the people at the commission seemed very happy, and a bunch of us gathered at a hotel afterwards, some of my staff, to kind of decompress. And one of the debate people saw me on the way out, and they said, "Hey, maybe we'll see you in 4 years." And if I recall, my words were, "Lose my number." Now that was in the heat of the moment. I'd certainly be open to discuss another one, but. I'm going to wear a flak vest next time. And I will tell you, the one thing, I joke about the nervousness, but the one thing going into a debate like that, I knew that I was going to either be very popular or very hated. And that's not a fun position for a journalist. Not that we're in a popularity contest, because I always remind people that news isn't supposed to make you happy. Sometimes we're going to do stories that you're going to shake your fist at the TV or throw your shoe at it. So it's not in that nature, but knowing how divided the country was, that there was no coming out of this being liked by everybody. So there was that, there was kind of that hanging over. So in the days after the debate, my email was very funny. I'd sit there with my iPhone and, I'd flip down. I'm like, awesome job, terrific, loser. And I got them in a big stack printed up somewhere. Someday it'll make its way in a book.
So you went from campaign to election to post-election, and you, in May of 2017, you had an exclusive interview with President Trump just after he fired FBI Director James Comey. Can we go ahead and play a little bit of a clip from that? Thanks.
Let me ask you about your termination letter to Mr. Comey. You write, I greatly appreciate you informing me on 3 separate occasions that I am not under investigation. Why did you put that in there?
Because he told me that. He told me
He
that.
told you weren't under investigation
Yeah,
with
and
regard
I've
to the
heard
Russia
that.
investigation?
I've heard that from others. I think.
Was it in a phone call? Did you meet face to face?
I had a dinner with him. He wanted to have dinner because he wanted to stay on. We had a very nice dinner at the White House
asked for the
very
dinner?
early on. A dinner was arranged. I think he asked for the dinner.
That was fun too.
Okay, so 2 questions. How do you go about interviewing a president, and how do you go about interviewing this president?
Well, I'd interviewed Donald Trump as candidate prior to that, and I learned a few things about him. You also realize how time flies so quickly when you're interviewing a person of that importance, because the time you're given is usually fairly limited.
How much time did you have? Do you remember?
I think we were told about 15 minutes and then a walk and talk. I will say they were very generous with their time. His time, I think we went over, and I think I ended the interview. I don't think they gave me the cut sign. But at any rate, when I'm trying to remember, when I first booked that interview, I went to the White House and had a meeting and said, look, we should do this. And they ushered me in the White House, and I ask the president. So we should do an interview. We haven't done an interview. And he immediately agreed. At the time, a lot of the conversation was going to be geared on Korea. I had just returned from several days in South Korea, spending time with the U.S. military, so I said, we really should talk about that. Well, then they got back to us rather quickly with a date, and then, of course, the Comey firing happened, so we knew, obviously, what the bulk of the interview was going to be. So that was, those questions were, I think any journalist would have asked them. I mean, the timing was such that, you know, why did you fire him? What were the circumstances? You know, why did he tell you weren't under investigation? All those things, I think were all pretty basic questions.
I don't know, it didn't look that basic. But in all seriousness, how do you think about interviewing a president? How do you think about balancing the appropriate level of respect for the office, but the need to get questions answered?
It's a good point, because I not only have respect for the office, I respect people I talk to in general. I don't, you know, I think if you're giving, you know, you've agreed to give me your time, then you deserve my respect. Doesn't mean you're gonna pull punches, but, and that's what I hopefully did there. But I knew that we had to get answers to those questions, and I didn't have time for, you know, take me down a path and deflect and all that. This was a time, so, you know, I call it the kind of the water drip style, and I think you know, it helped us achieve what we wanted to get with some of those answers. Again, watching the clock, not knowing when, you know, how much time I really had. So I wanted to keep making sure we got answers so we could go back and look, and he said this and he said that. And, you know, one thing about this president is he likes to own things. And he certainly did it in that case. I mean, you know, I fired him. I mean, and so that in many ways made it easy. I got my rhythm of pressing for the answers, hopefully as respectfully as I could, but also, you know, you have to interrupt it. I remember one of the headlines in one of the conservative-leaning outlets was not any of the news that was made there. It was that I had interrupted him 9 times in the first 3 minutes or something like that, which I probably did. But I think it was effective in trying to get some of the answers.
Because you got some.
We got some. Yeah, some that kind of shocked me, but we did.
Most shocking?
I think there's just the quick ownership of why he fired him, and mentioning, you know, the Russia connections so early without any of me. I hadn't even dug at that point, so that was a little, wow, interesting.
How do you think about your role covering politics, your role as a journalist in this not just incredibly polarized time, but in a time when the role of the media is under attack, when fake news has been weaponized as a term of derision for people doing your job? How has that caused you, or has it caused you to rethink, recalibrate what it means to be a journalist?
Well, I think it's, I look at it from the standpoint, I think it's been beneficial, not that we'd ever wish for this, but it's been beneficial in that I think we're even more careful than we've ever been, and I think we're very careful at an organization like, you know, NBC News. There's a legacy, a tradition of excellence, of fact-checking, of, you know, attribution of sources, those sorts of things. But you tend to double down in a case like this when you're being accused, not only as a network, but across the broad, sweeping landscape of journalism, that you've got to get it right. And sometimes I wish the critics, I wish I could sit them down and say, let me tell you about some other stories, some incredible stories that we never told because we only had one source, or maybe we only had 2 sources that probably are true and are probably pretty interesting, but we have to operate in that level of, when we go on the air with something, we've got to be able to back it up, because a lot of people believe, you know, that, you know, doubt what they hear is true, which gets me out of my next little soapbox, which I've been preaching about for years, and it's the importance of critical thinking in our society. I think it should be a requirement in every junior and senior high school, to learn to look at information and, you know, move it around, twist it around, poke it and prod it, and figure out if it's real. And, you know, where it's coming. All the things that we do as journalists. We talk about citizen journalists now. That phrase kind of came on when we started getting smartphones, and now everyone's a journalist because we have the cameras and the platforms. But if we're going to do the citizen journalist thing, then we've got to go the next step and do what journalists do, which is, what do they say? If your mother says she loves you, check it out. I said that once with my mom in the room. That was weird. I was doing a speech, and I said it, and I looked at her, and I was like, oh wow. But I think that's incredibly important right now. That I feel this responsibility not only to inform our viewers, but to try and hopefully impart to them that you need to not only hold us up accountable, but all sources of information accountable right now. That in itself is a good exercise.
Are there things that the journalism community, whether it's television, print, online, can be doing to kind of peel back the curtain and inform their audiences of their process, of their fact-checking, of their sourcing? Do we need to do a better job at that?
We have to find the time, and I think we're certainly doing that more and more, find the time in the story, because the time is always our enemy in this business. We need the piece in 2 minutes or minute 45, but those lines are very important that, 3 senior officials in the Pentagon or, 2 people in the Centers for Disease or whatever it may be, try to help people understand that these are multiple sources of information, reliable sources. So we hope between that, being very transparent, and also relying on our history and the experience of the correspondents or household names in many cases, that I tend to think that it's not so much that people doubt what an organization like NBC really says. I think it's a question of, do you want to believe it? And I think that's part of what we're fighting right now is, I forget what musical it was, Don't Tell Me No Bad News. Was that Wiz? I don't know what it was. But, I think that there's a little bit of that going on right now. It's denial. Don't tell me my team is wrong. Don't tell me my team had an error. That makes me unhappy. So therefore, it's a lie or you're biased. And that gets back to what I said a moment ago and we have to remind ourselves this because we are in a popularity contest. Ratings are important, personalities are important, so I'm not going to pretend that doesn't exist. But we also have to remember at the end of the day, news isn't about being popular. I read stories sometimes that I'm like, wow, that just ruined my worldview of something I thought differently. But the facts are the facts. And maybe we need to remind people of that sometimes, that we're not here to make you happy. We're hoping you're tuning in because we're going to really do our best to give you the perspective on a story, but it may in fact change your worldview or how you think about things.
I want to just talk to you a little bit about some of the places that you've seen, the stories that you've covered outside of politics. And maybe you referenced your Korea trip. Tell us a little bit about that trip and what you discovered reporting there.
Well, the 19-hour trip I just took, they've got a great breakfast at the Westin. That's about all I really learned on the ground there. The one I took a little earlier this year, we spent time with the military, South Korean and American.
And that was the one you took before the interview with the president that you referenced. Okay.
Yeah, that one really put on my mind how precarious that peninsula is, and if the balloon goes up, that a lot of people are going to die. I mean, Seoul is a sprawling city. It is well within artillery range, and you can look at the mountains and looking up toward the north, where their artillery placements are there. I spent time in with the Air Force, and they've got they walked me through the non-classified portion of their war plan.
Which is what? What is?
Well, it was essentially, we think we can neutralize the artillery threat. I think it was, don't quote me, I think it was 48 hours. I'm thinking, well, 48 hours, a lot of people can die from artillery, and they recognize that. The other thing is the enormous task of evacuating American citizens there, American military dependents. They said, look, that's almost the top of the plan. We can't necessarily get them out by air if there's rockets flying through the air, ships. I mean, there's a lot to break off there. During my last trip, I was able to interview the foreign minister, and their position, the South Korean position, is that there should be no hostilities, initiated without their consent, for obvious reasons. I mean, they're very concerned, and they should be. The other thing was, I think in that clip there was Osan Air Base. I've been to a lot of military bases, and this looked like one in a war zone because there's no airplanes out on the flight line. They're all in bomb-hardened shelters, which is another kind of reminder. Then you look across the runway and there's Patriot missile batteries pointing to the north. So it is, it's the real deal, waiting to happen. So as hearing that, seeing that, and then hearing some of the schoolyard talk between these two nuclear-powered nations, I'll tell you.
And by the way, and then reading Nick Kristof, who had a similar experience, right, going into North Korea, and sort of the flip side of that is his writing.
It's disturbing. When you see this and you realize what a hair trigger this is and how many people could die, it's quite disturbing.
Thank you. I'm getting my signal from the front row that
do what I do, ignore
them. It's Colette. I cannot ignore Colette. But really what I can't ignore is that, as I noted, we have some student journalists who have been tasked with coming up with far better questions than I've come up with for Lester. So since Colette has prompted me and reminded me that it's time, we're going to do that. And we're going to start with Garrett Schwartz. Garrett, you can stand up. Garrett's a senior, and I believe you have a question about journalists' use of social media.
Correct. Mr. Holt, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Garrett.
Social media, and in particular Twitter, has given journalists a platform to better engage with their audience. But at the same time, it's also given them an opportunity to weigh in on important stories and political issues or social issues. Given that journalists and reporters are supposed to be purely objective figures, do you feel that engaging on Twitter and possibly even showing bias in certain cases is problematic?
I have personal issues with Twitter. I tend to use it as promotional, hey, I'm in Korea or whatever, we got the story coming on tonight, or informative, president just signed, whatever. I think there are several traps for journalists right now at a time that we're under attack, that everybody wants to know our opinion. And even now, as we've had this discussion, I'm very guarded because that's what gets us in trouble. It's one thing to tap onto our expertise. You've covered this, some of the questions you asked, you've covered this, your observations. But when we get into the pundit world too much, I think we risk falling into these traps. And I think Twitter can be one of those traps. I think it is a useful tool for, here's what I'm seeing, we just got this incredible interview, we're gonna have it tonight, or I just sat down with President Trump, he told me X, Y, and Z more tonight. That's where I feel safer, but I think I think journalists have to be very, very careful right now of falling into this kind of pundit trap, unless that's what you want to be. And it's all about transparency. We know that there are programs on cable where they're very transparent about this is provocative, opinion-oriented television. Twitter, in its 140 or 280 characters right now, doesn't give you a lot of opportunity to kind of be that transparent. But it's a good question. Thank you.
But then when you think about journalists today across all platforms are encouraged to build strong social media following. And if you know about the rules of engagement in social media, it's be voicey, have a personality, engage in more human ways. And how are you seeing journalists balance those very real demands of social media without compromising or revealing a sense of bias?
Well, I think the trap, and this is something I've discussed at our place and publicly as well, I think one of the traps right now is you can report, but doesn't necessarily mean you have to show a sense of glee. And by that I mean there's a lot of great investigative reporting going on right now. There's a lot of unprecedented things happening in government, which are making for some really fascinating stories. But again, all eyes are on us in a way that they've never been before. And we have got to be able to, have our gets and our exclusives, but not with a aha, or we're smarter, we're the smartest guys in the room, or we're self-righteous, because we've got to defend we've got to defend this industry, and that we know is so important to as a pillar to a healthy society, but at the same time not give the critics out there the ammunition. And so I'm falling down on an example right now, but there are reporters who manage to thread that needle every day by often beat reporters. At the White House, some of the White House correspondents will kind of have a constant feed that I read, and they give you great insight. Now there are other people who clearly are commentators, and again, as long as you present yourself that way, I think the most important thing about journalism right now is transparency. Be who you say you are. I represent proudly a mainstream news organization. I know that's a negative term among a lot of folks, but that's what I do. That's the expectation of our audience. They don't expect me to come on and voice my opinion every night, but they do expect me to not be blind and to call out things that need to be called out.
Thank you. We're going to go to Lauren Floyd. Lauren is one of our master's student. She has a question about ethics, I believe.
Yes, good evening, Mr. Holt.
Good evening.
Objectivity and fairness is something we're constantly discussing as a very important factor to our reporting. You touched on it a little bit in your previous response, but I'd like to know if you feel there is an ethical approach for journalists to include themselves and their perspectives in their stories. If there is an ethical approach, maybe you can give an example.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny you use the word perspective is important, which is not always the same thing as opinion. You can come at a story that, listen, I could do a series of stories on racism from the perspective of an African American. Doesn't necessarily mean a bias, but it means there's a sensitivity there. I'm presenting it as such. I'm not hiding it. It's obviously an issue that would be of greater, focus or sensitivity that I would bring to it. So I think you hit the nail on the head. Perspective is probably one of the most important things we do in our storytelling is how does this fit in? And I'll go back to that transparency. The viewer or the reader knowing that that's where you're coming from. I think I'm losing the word. A point of view type journalist is another word for it.
Advocacy journalism?
Yeah. Well, anyway, the idea of coming at a story from a particular viewpoint is time honored. It's analysis. Analysis is incredibly important. A lot of the stories we're following right now are coming at us so fast. The Russia investigation, and it requires this is how it fits together. This is what this means. This is what could happen. That's not, that's perfectly ethical, I think. It's not a bias. It's walking people through things. I think that when you talk about ethics, it's about being honest with your viewers or your readers about where you're coming from. And that's really, I think that's probably the best answer I've got for that question.
By the way, you all are allowed to follow up if you feel like you're not getting the answer from Lester.
You can give me this treatment if you want.
Go dive back in with a follow, exactly. Eitan Wallace is a senior. Go ahead.
Thank you, Dean Bay, and hi, Mr. Holt, and welcome, Mrs. Holt, as well to USC Annenberg. First and foremost, just want to say what a pleasure it was for me to intern for NBC Nightly News in the West Coast Bureau last fall.
Love that.
And
good.
Thank you. And thank you very much.
Shout out to NBC.
And you are so kind. When you came into the LA Bureau, you would say hi to the producers, correspondents, and yes, the interns. And
because I might be working for you someday. I'm not a fool.
But your kind and gracious nature went
Thank you.
unnoticed. So thanks so much. Did not go unnoticed, rather. In an interview with Politico in 2015, you said, quote, "At the end of the day, people want to come back to newscasts like ours because you get a half hour of hits, runs, and errors of the day with perspective. And I think that the evening news broadcasts are still viable and probably more necessary than ever in a very noisy environment." So with this quote in mind, Mr. Holt, how do you feel about the current state of broadcast news, and where do you see the industry heading in the future?
Well, it's a lot to unpack there. I mean, the truth about broadcast news is, viewership is declining, and a lot of that is simply the same reason that many other forms of communication are being affected. We have more choices, and it's not necessarily watching another newscast. It could be Netflix or Xbox or whatever. I mean, all those things research will show are affecting us. At the same time, the 3 evening newscasts, probably tonight, 24, 25 million people tuned in. And that many people don't tune into a lot of things these days because it is so scattered. So I think there's a long-term viability. By that quote I meant, I'll expand upon it, is that it's really, really noisy out there. From the time you turn on, whether it's your iPhone or your TV or your radio, whatever you turn on in the morning, you're being told what to think. All day long. Someone's telling you this is this, and he's a crook, and men are bad, and whatever it is. All day long, and we like to be that place. It's like, oh, okay, we know you heard this, and we know we don't want to pretend like you haven't heard the news of the day because you have. We're not living in the 20th century. We understand that people are getting text alerts, but so we want to do is back to that perspective word is like, here's what happened today. We know you heard about this. This is what it means. This is what we know, and this is what we don't know. And one of the things I talk about a lot in journalism is we have to be as transparent with what we don't know. Sometimes when I got this job, you probably know the story. I mean, it came upon me very suddenly, and I kind of laughed. I would joke to my wife. I said, "Everybody thinks I'm smart all of a sudden because I went from the weekend guy to the weekday guy. Now I'm smart."
Smart, and you got a sizzle reel. So.
Yeah, I got a sizzle reel. I mean, but we're not. And I think sometimes we tell people what we know, what we don't know, be honest with them, and recognize that they've been bombarded all day by all this stuff, and you'll watch this stuff run away on social media. And back to the social media question, one of the problems that we have is competing with it. It's so far ahead of us because you can tweet something out right now. We'll see it on Twitter or Dataminer, one of those things. It'd be a great story. But now we have to go through that process of actually making phone calls, of actually checking with people, checking sources. And in the meantime, what you tweeted has run across the country, and that's the unique challenge. We're not competing, I mean, we compete with ABC and CBS, but not as much as we compete with all of you who are, kind of controlling the news cycle to a large extent from social media, which gets back to my other thing about, that the responsibility of citizen journalists is they've got to take the whole responsibility of journalism, and that means going through the process. It's a little bit of wishful thinking because, the speed and pace of communication is what it is, but that's my wish. I hope I answered your question. Thank you.
And Jordan Winters.
Thank you so much for being here, Mr. Holt. So I'm wondering, when you look at the golden age of network news, what do icons like Walter Cronkite have that anchors today don't? And what can we learn from that generation of journalists about reinstating trust in the media?
Well, a few things. I had the privilege of moderating a discussion very much like this at Pepperdine, I think back in 2006, 2007 with Walter Cronkite. And it was interesting to hear his perspective. And one of the things I took away from it, as I think about the situation we're in right now, he told a story of being on the air, and I don't know if this happened more than one time, but certainly once on the air, he was reporting something about the Vietnam War. And during a film package, one of his producers comes out and says, "The president's on the line for you. He really wants to talk to you, LBJ," because he was pissed off about something he had said. And I tell that story now because that this relationship between the media and the White House, it's always been adversarial. I mean, certainly we haven't seen it on quite the vocal level, but it's rooted in something that is part of that American give and take between the institutions of power and the media. Theirs was an era where, my family, we watched the, Walter Cronkite and John Chancellor, but there was no other place to get your news. I mean, I lived in towns where there were 3 channels. I lived in Alaska for a while where they actually they would record the nightly news in LA, they would put it on a plane and fly it to Anchorage, and it would run around 9:30 or 10 at night, and sometimes the announcer would come on and say, "Due to non-arrival of tape, the CBS Evening News and Walter Cronkite will not be seen." But I mean, that was where we got our news and the pictures and and what was happening in the Vietnam War. We don't, as I said, we recognize we are not that broadcast. We cannot be that broadcast because you have your news from other sources now. And that's why our newscasts have been tailored to an audience that, back to my metaphor, the hits, runs, and errors of the day. They know those things. They know that Al Franken's in trouble, but they don't know maybe, well, what does it mean to be an ethics investigation in the Senate? Could he lose his seat? All those things. So that's what we try to bring to the table.
So before we go to audience question, just thinking about Walter Cronkite generation, Lester Holt generation, and now Stefan Holt's generation, your son. So watching your son's career unfold, right, in an entirely different media ecosystem and climate, what do you think are the most significant differences and challenges facing a generation of up-and-coming journalists?
Well, I think that one of the things I talk about when I talk to up-and-coming journalists is you're in a much harsher, meaner environment. When I was coming up, I did a lot of stupid things on TV and things that people probably were watching like, what an idiot. But you know what? They forgot about it the next day because they couldn't click on it.
By the way, thank the good Lord.
Yeah, I mean,
I mean,
we had it easy because not that we didn't screw up, but we didn't. I can't go on the internet and find those screw ups. I can find the ones I do now, but they're not as entertaining as the ones I used to do. So that's really important. You're growing up in a harsher, meaner environment out there. It's also becoming a more fractured business. So I don't know what that means in terms of the. There will be jobs out there. There's always going to be a need for people to tell stories. But one of the things I've seen happen in my career is, while the gathering of news and the reporting of news hasn't changed, the platforms that we put them on have changed. I see myself in the back of a taxi now, or on an airplane, and certainly on the phones and all these places. I mean, I may be in your wallpaper in 2 years, but that doesn't really affect me in terms of my storytelling. Now, back to the social media thing, a few of us dinosaurs are still being dragged fully into it. I have my reservations, even as I embrace some of the tools. But in terms of the evening broadcast, I think that it will be a tradition that will continue, but it will have to evolve just as we've evolved from the Cronkite and Chancellor era to reflect the way people consume their news. Maybe it won't be at 6:30 every night. Maybe it will move to the internet. I don't know, but I think that people are always going to want to have a touchstone or rock or something to hold on to in these bumpy times. Because I don't see an end to the bumpy times. I think that we just live in a frenetic kind of a pace right now, with a little dash of chaos. But I think the hugest challenge, and I alluded to it earlier, was that this sense of numbness that if we ever get to the point where we're beyond shock, and I think some days I feel that we're getting to the point where, not only in our political environment, but as I said, in terms of, terror, and you look at somebody drives up on a bike path, and I think there's a sense of helplessness that I happen to ride that bike path. And I think that you're starting to see that in terms of the way these stories people quickly moving on. And I guess part of our job as journalists is to continue to point out what is not normal. Mm-hmm. And some of these things are not normal, and we shouldn't be numb about it. And maybe the calling is, as I say it to myself, maybe the calling is that we have to continue to remind people that get upset, that some of these things are not acceptable in our society, and that we've got to pay attention.
Great, thank you. We are going to go to the audience now. Not sure if anybody has a question. There we go.
I'll let you pick.
Thanks for coming out tonight.
Sure.
Kind of playing off what you just talked about. What would you say to people who feel maybe exhaustion with all the news that's going on right now, and they want to tune out? What would you say, kind of the importance for people in society to pay attention still?
Well, I think it's, we've got to care. But I will tell you, there are days, not a lot of them, but there are days I look at the rundown of the newscast and I'm like, I'll tell you, I said it the other day. There was a newscast, and I said in the newsroom, I said, this has a high icky factor tonight. It was just like, you know, but it is the news. And, you know, listen, I'm the anchor of the show. I got to get back on the horse. And I'll just go back to what I said a moment ago. It's reminding people that some of these things aren't normal, that we can affect change. You know, debate is good. You know, I think we're in this divided society where we're like, debate is bad. No, debate is good. Healthy, intelligent, informed debate is good. We're the informers. You know, every time there's a mass killing, we know that there's a big discussion about gun control, and it feels like it goes nowhere. And well, tonight, you know, Pete Williams reported that no, the NRA may sign on to some specific issues related to how the Air Force didn't pass on information about the shooter in Texas, and that allowed him to get guns. I'm not getting at a gun control argument, but the point is that, you know, rooted in these shocking things are some real issues that we as a society still can affect. Yeah, I mean, a truck driving up at a sidewalk, that's a hard one. But, you know, we still, as citizens, we still have the right to, you know, ask our security officials, our government, to protect us better and to find a way to stand up. And, you know, we can't necessarily advocate as journalists, but we can shine the light on it. One of the things that I've noticed in our business is sometimes we'll look at a subject and go, well, it's a little weedy, or people aren't paying attention to it, but there are stories sometimes that are hanging just right below the line. And I said, you know, I make the argument, we can make people care about anything. If we decide we want you to, you know, care about the price of mayonnaise, we could do it. If we just put the resources. And I remember during at the height of the immigration crisis, you know, I said, you know, we're not really paying as much attention to this. And so, you know, we took the show on the road to Hungary, and, you know, we're there, you saw a bit of the clip, and, you know, the audience stayed with us on that. When we went to Korea in April, that story was still kind of bubbling, the whole war of words. And I said, we can make people care about this. And that's why we went and spent time in the military. So we have this incredible power as journalists. The technology we have is beyond anything I had growing up. I mean, I have, you know, I have done stories where I'm on the air with me and my iPhone. I mean, that's it. We can get on the air from anywhere on the planet right now. So don't underestimate the power of the media.
Great. I'm going to let Elizabeth. Yeah, I'm going to. Why not? You're sitting in the front row. You're.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you again for being here. We
Sure.
really appreciate it. My question is about opinions. There is such a space right now for opinions, whether it is Twitter, as the gentleman back here was talking about, social media. There's right-leaning platforms, there's left-leaning platforms, there's cable news, there's radio, there's just opinions everywhere. So what does that mean for traditional journalism? Is there less of it, do you think, today? And what's the response with traditional journalism with all the opinions flying around every second?
I think I think that cable has certainly proven that there is a huge appetite for opinion-oriented journalism. I mean, you know, you can turn on TV tonight, and, you know, Msnbc and Fox and CNN, and you'll hear a lot of opinions and a lot of, you know, talking head pundits. So I think it has. It may have narrowed the runway for traditional journalism. At the same time, I live in the hope that will fuel, it'll have the opposite, the backlash of people feeling they want to, just give me the facts, give me the facts. One of the exercises that I tell people to do, and I shouldn't do this publicly, but I think it's I've never done it, but because I can't anymore, but I always think, wouldn't it be fascinating to turn on the State of the Union address, watch it, as soon as the president says, God bless America, good night, turn it off. And then go into a news blackout for several hours. And then what do you think? Not what the panel sitting around me thinks, you know, not what they're saying on Twitter, but what do you think? Go through the process. Well, he just talked about taxes. He just talked about, you know, trade with China. And I don't know that we can do it anymore because we're so plugged in anymore. But this gets back to what I'm saying. It's like everyone's telling us what to think. And it's like we don't have any space or room to go through that process on our own and think and, you know, form our own opinions, because by the next morning, what happens is after whatever it is, Academy Awards, whatever it is, Twitter's taken over, and the next morning we all know our talking points. Did you see that? Did you see the president swigging his water last night? I mean, it's the, which we didn't do that story, by the way, but so you got me one of my soapboxes.
Do you want to go in the front? We'll do one, and then we'll do maybe one more after that, and we'll go to a student.
Lester, I understand that you began your career working for a country western radio station as a DJ.
I did.
And I'd like to know who your favorite country western star is.
Well, I was a junior in high school up in Sacramento, and what I really wanted to be was a radio disc jockey. That was my true passion. But I took this job, as a country western station, working midnight to 6 on Saturday and Sundays, the all-night trucking show. The call letters, you ready for the call letters? KRAK, crack radio. How do you think that would play in 2017? Isn't that a felony? But yeah, I did it, and then I started college at Sac State, and they offered me a full-time job if I would be a news guy. So they gave me a Jeep Cherokee with some police and fire scanners in it, and said, "You're a newsman." And so I learned on the job. I chased fire trucks and police cars, went to city council meetings, and I learned. And a hush went over the room, and I dropped out of college when I was a junior. I'm still working on that degree, by the way.
We can help you with that.
You can, yeah. You know somebody? But it was. But back to I was totally evading your question. I was a big fan of. I used to like the names of country songs. Like one of my favorite was "Drop Kick Me Jesus to the Goalpost of Life." End over end through them righteous uprights. I actually didn't like country back then. Now I do, but sure.
So when it comes
That's a White House move.
Yeah, exactly.
Follow-up question.
Hey!
When it comes to line dancing, are you somewhere between ball and chain or boot, scoot, and boogie?
I don't know, honey. Ball and chain, all right.
Thank you, Carol. All right, we're going to do one more. Maybe this gentleman on the. Yep, we're getting you a mic.
So I just wanted to start off by saying that I'm of Cuban descent, so your Cuban story really meant a lot to me when you reported on that.
And which one, sir?
The story you did in Cuba.
Oh, thanks.
So, because I'm Cuban descent, so that was awesome. You talked about being biased and having, trying, keep your personal opinion out of a story. How do you do that as a journalist? What tips would you recommend? Because sometimes something does hit close to home, something is personal. What do you recommend in that circumstance when you try to report?
That's a great question. Fortunately, I've always been blessed by, I'm not a particularly argumentative person. I love intelligent conversation. I love when people can challenge each other and in a very, respectful way. And so when I was at Msnbc, I would do more of these, debates where you had people on, and I would try to keep them as civil as possible. I remember asking Tim Russert one time, who did Meet the Press, and I said, Tim, I watch you, and they never fight. And you get people from different sides, but they're always respectful. And he goes, because I always tell them that we're not about that we want, he would get in there and tell folks that we're not going to do this. We're going to have a really good discussion. And I think it's so important. It's easy for me, but the most important thing, I think, as you approach it is just, it's put your viewer or your reader first. Your viewer or your reader who needs to know about this topic. Here's this person who may, listen, I've interviewed plenty of people where inside I'm thinking this guy's an idiot. But that's not the point. It doesn't matter what I think. And that person deserves my respect. They're sitting down talking with me, and we need to get as much out of him as we can, because it's about our audiences. It's about informing them and helping them make decisions. One of our competitors has a great line. I wish I had it, which is, we report, you decide. It's, if you could follow through with it, it's a great line.
Now we really are going to do one last question. I'm going to go to this young lady here who's been raising her hand. Right behind you is a mic. There you go.
Thank you so much for being here, Mr. Holt. Speaking of China, fun fact is that Chinese students, they watch NBC nightly news to practice English listening.
Wonderful.
I'm one of them.
Now I'm self-conscious about my grammar, but
Yeah, so my question is about international reporting. So when you are reporting in a foreign country, how do you prevent your American perspective or some cultural stereotypes we have on some countries, for example, North Korea, that might limit your news judgments or might even prevent you from doing some, equal or justice reporting?
I think that's a great question. It's one I've thought about a lot. On the whole question of bias, I am biased, and we're all biased because we're all products of our circumstances. I was born in the United States. I lived on military bases. I'm African American. I'm Christian. I'm straight. All those things form who I am as a human being, and I can't escape those things. So it's important to it's important to recognize that in yourself and kind of open yourself to the fact that I remember when the Iraq War broke out and Al Jazeera was considered, propaganda and all this, and I had to stand back and go, you know what? They're telling the truth, we're telling the truth, but we come from different perspectives. So as an American reporter, it's probably true I give more weight to, our government officials than I might other government officials. So someone at the Pentagon says, there's 1,000 tanks in wherever, and we tend to believe it. And sometimes we fall into that trap. Meantime, Chinese authorities claim that, and we've got to be very careful of that. But that's a product of your experience. And I think the most important thing is to recognize it. And give the benefit of the doubt when you go to these other places that, we're all looking at the same thing, but we're sometimes looking it through those eyes of that natural bias, is I guess what I like to call it. I think it's just an important thing to recognize and to not walk around so smugly and think I'm totally, immune to any other influences, because we are. Hope that answers your question.
Lester, thank you immensely for joining us tonight.
Thank you. It was fun.
A great Becky Tonatelli expert in residence.
Thank you.
So thank you. And thank you all for being here.
It's been a great audience. Thank you.